So welcome to Public Engagement with Science, Defining and Measuring Success. I'm Heather Douglas, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. Thank you for joining us. This is the format we're going to have for this afternoon's panel. Each panelist will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Panelists will then have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issues that they raise in their talks with each other, because undoubtedly they will have things to discuss. We will then open the floor to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. You can also comment on questions and upvote questions for the panelists. So that's a place to have a lot of interaction about the questions. Please do follow the community standards for the event, which are found on our website, and we're also linked to in your Eventbrite registration information. On Twitter, please use the hashtag Pews2020. Recordings of the events will be posted on the YouTube channel Pews2020 after the event, and we have a link to that channel from our main website. If there are any technical issues that we can help you with, and there are lots of things we can't help you with, but we can help you with some, please email them at pews2020.tech@gmail.com. And after today's event, we will be having a happy hour reception in Spatial Chat. I'll be posting that link at the end of the webinar, and you also received it in your registration information for today. So that's what we're going to do. I want to introduce this panel before we get started. Following from the preceding panel, which was about community engagement, this panel will provide the community perspective on collaborations with and tensions with academia and how they work with academic partners who do community-focused public engagement. To discuss the practice of public engagement, we have an excellent set of panelists. First, we have Rebecca Newberry. She is the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York's Executive Director and has over 10 years of experience developing and managing successful issue campaigns, including environmental enforcement, climate and energy policy, and state budget legislation. We then have Thomas Welcenbach, who has been researching lead in Milwaukee's drinking water since joining the Get the Lead Out Coalition in February 2018. Thomas's research as a graduate student culminated in the article, Power to the People, Contesting Urban Poverty and Power Inequities Through Open GIS. Ben Pauli is president of the board of directors of the Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint, as well as being a representative on the Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and assistant professor of social science at Kettering University in Flint, Michigan. And finally, we have Renee Wallace, who leads two entrepreneurial entities, Doer's Edge as CEO and Food Plus Detroit as executive director. She is an MSU community partner, and her first major engagement involved being co-developer of the community track for the inaugural MSU Innovations in Collaborative Modeling Conference in 2015. So as you can see, this is a perfectly wonderful panel to discuss these issues. You can read more about each of our panelists, including statements about how they think about success in their work on our website. But now let's hear from our panelists. Rebecca?
Great, hello everyone. So I'm just gonna share my screen real quick and get this up. So my name is Rebecca Newberry. Again, I'm the executive director of Clean Air Coalition based in Western New York State. Our organization is an environmental justice and public health organization with our theory of change being rooted in community organizing. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, but in the context of what has been really successful, recent really successful partnerships with technical experts and researchers, and oops, sorry about that, and what did not go so well. All right, so a little bit about us. So our end goal in our organization is to more equitably distribute power throughout the community. So we're a membership-based organization. Our members live in the city of Buffalo and the town of Tonawanda in the North Towns, which is a first ring suburb of Buffalo. And they live in communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution and work in workplaces that also put their lives at risk. So our model is really focused on community organizing, collective action, and looking for solutions that cause and impact on the ground change. So how we do this is we facilitate and support our member-led campaigns. So organization exists in terms of teams. Those teams are made up of folks from the community that make decisions regarding how that campaign or how that program will run. We really prioritize and ground leadership and organizing of poor and working class people and people of color. We build and align shared interests to advance community and equity. So these are opportunities for our community teams, our campaign teams, to come together and work to do a broader systems change work. And I said before, we also take collective action. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I want to just say that when we do participate in community-based research, which we do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, it's only one of many strategies that we use. So, and when we do partner with researchers or do our own research, it's always to back up an actionable campaign that leads to on-the-ground changes in our communities. And our end goal here, right, is not just to change or reduce pollution, although we do that, and not just to get better rights on the job, which we also do, but really look at how do these individual pieces of what we can bring to the table here really focus on bringing new processes. That end goal is to redistribute wealth and decision making. Our analysis is that our members are disproportionately impacted, and we see death, cancer, illnesses. It's not the chemicals create these conditions, but they're not the process that creates these conditions. And the process is how our economy runs, the way that white supremacy is impacting in our institutions. Those are really the processes and the conditions that our end goal is to change and to shift. And we bring this with us and this analysis with us in any work that we do with researchers and professional experts. So I'm going to tell a story here about Tonawanda, New York. So Tonawanda, New York, it's a first ring suburb. This is a map of Tonawanda. The city of Buffalo is to the south. We've got Niagara Falls up here. This is west and east. This is the Niagara River that flows in the Great Lakes by Lake Erie. And all of the yellow dots you see are major air pollution sources. And this is where our organization really founded. Tonawanda has the highest rates of air pollution in the state, and from industrial sources, extremely high ranks of leukemia and cancers. And I want to focus right now, we've worked a lot of campaigns in Tonawanda on air and soil contamination, but the one I want to focus on is Tonawanda Coke. So Tonawanda Coke is a Coke manufacturer. It existed for about 100 years, owned by different entities. And our organizing really started with this company that was releasing very high rates of benzene and VOCs into the air. Resident organizing led to a New York State air quality study that was done, an enforcement action that resulted in a raid of a plant in 2010, and then criminal charges. The company was found guilty in 2003 or 13 and sentenced in 2014, 14 different federal laws under RCRA and the Clean Air Act. And during the time between the sentencing and the penalty, our organization ran a campaign attempting to find control over that fine money. So the community came together and brainstormed projects, submitted those projects to the judge. We did, a 1-week polling where folks got to vote on how they wanted to see the fines be used. It was endorsed by the U.S. delegation as well as the Western New York delegation, and had backings from the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo, et cetera, et cetera. And so the end result of this criminal sentence actually resulted in a $10 million health study, which the community did not ask for, to the University of Buffalo to do sampling and testing of humans, looking at the connections between benzene and cancer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But I want to say that our struggle here really didn't end in 2014. You can kind of read here that the company continued to act until found in parole violation a few years ago, at what point declared bankruptcy, and now we're in a real struggle here to get the land cleaned up. And if you can see by this picture, you can see from space, it's a pretty egregious, there's a lot of egregious violations that are still taking place on that site. So, all right, so good news before I move into the research study. So, as a result of the shutdown, there's been tremendous decreases in benzene in the neighborhood. We know this because we fight and continue to fight for 24-hour monitors in the neighborhood. And we're really focusing now on remediation and redevelopment of the site in a way where developers basically won't landfill it. Okay. So when we engage in research in this specific situation and also situations, we don't believe knowledge is power, right? We believe power is power. And we think it's wonderful that people want to learn things. It's great to raise awareness, right? But in the end of the day, you know, that doesn't really do anything for the people that I work with in my community as well, right? So we are doing this because we want to actually enhance our participation in the political process and impact policy and regulatory frameworks. We also use research as a way of working to advocate with decision makers. But again, the end result there is to change the situation that we're living in, right? So we engage in research through a research policy. We have collaboration between our members and researchers, but the real end piece of this is that, you know, we only engage in research for the campaign's sake. So you can find a little bit of this online in my bio, links to kind of our research application and the process that academics have to follow. But really, you know, again, the end result is what benefit does it bring our membership? So in this $10 million study, we had a situation, this kind of like the bad, what not to do, right? Where we had researchers reaching out to us in 2014, 2015, you know, just kind of a what not to do if you're working with communities. Know the streets that, you know, the impact is happening on. You know, in this case, they didn't know where the neighborhood was. They you know, were talking to cancer survivors and people that were actually going through chemo and other things where we have to be very worried about, you know, you can't give up blood if you're doing chemo. So, you know, really focused a lot of the research study on taking blood samples, urine samples, and comparing benzene metabolite measurements against population survey data. And so for folks that are very familiar with benzene and leukemia, we have enough research here that shows that we know benzene causes leukemia. You know, there's regulatory frameworks based on the research. And so, you know, over the course of these few years, our board finally took a position after the researchers refused to even participate in our policy that, you know, we're going to reject this request. And so, again, go to all of this is on links to my bio, so you can read actually what my members, statement was in that case. And so where we are now really in the what to do, right, is we're in this fight over remediation. And so, you know, basically what they've done, the state has done is split the piece of land up into a tax subsidy program and an enforcement program. And our organization is really focused on ensuring that this voluntary tax subsidy remediation program, the Brownfield program, is done in a way that's comprehensive and actually protects our health down the road. So what we've done is we've partnered with New York Geology, which is a organization that has licensed geologists to work with our members on how to actually do these site assessments, look into the data that the state and the developers are providing, and ensuring everything from where they're placing their test location pits to any point throughout the remediation strategy or remediation process where the public has a chance to weigh in. The community members have an actual, you know, team that they can work with. And how these conversations go is, you know, my brother used to work at the plant, right? And, you know, he knew that there was a spill in the northern section at this year. The company never reported this spill. So, you know, then our researchers put together a comment that says, you know, I think we might want to do some investigation in the northern section of the plant. And so through this partnership, we've actually been able to win the creation of a working group in New York State. This actually just happened last week, where the New York State DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, will now equal the playing field a little bit more, where community members, our team, members of electoral leadership also get to one-on-one in a group setting, work with the developer, work with state enforcement officials to figure out what the end, you know, get to the end goal together. And so, you know, again, if folks want to reach out to me to talk about a little bit more how we did this, that would be great because I'm really excited about it. However, you know, I think the learning here is really that, you know, when we partner with researchers and technocrats, right, it needs to be in service of an organizing campaign. And so the research cannot be separate And really, experts need to look at how our organization and our membership's cultural and norms work and mold to us. And I think that's been the biggest difference between this partnership and other partnerships we've worked in. We came from a point of shared expertise where roles were seen as equal. And so the Clean Air organizing campaign team and the team with New York Geology had equal decision-making, equal roles, and the lead of the community members, the folks that were most impacted, were priority. The acknowledgement of race, gender, and class privileges that experts have, and particularly men with advanced degrees, white men with advanced degrees, is just acknowledged straight on. And so this looks like, when we're going up and meeting with elected officials, just little things like deferring to women leadership and deferring to women of color and deferring to the people that have hired you, right? It goes a long way. And also just like being very clear about that from the beginning. Clarity about resources. So I'm the thing, I think working class people, we can talk about money. It seems when you get into that middle class, owning class culture, money gets a little weird. So I just say getting very clear about who's putting in the work, the hours of work that are put in, and clear about what that's worth, I think is important from the beginning. And I just really want to drive home here that expertise and privilege are used and executed in a way that increases the institution, the EJ institution's credibility. I don't like working with experts that need to say I'm articulate, right? I think there's a lot of really coded language that people in professional spaces really need to do some work on because it can land as being condescending. And I think this partnership works really well because, again, the expertise is shared, and it's just that we do different things, and that's okay, right? And the facts sometimes aren't the only thing that matters. I heard this echoed earlier. Facts don't matter if you don't have power behind it. And I think that this is why this works really well with the organizing strategy, because you need both. And I think I'm speeding through this, but here's some more information, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was great. So much information, really fun to learn about. Thomas, you get to take it away now.
Okay. Good, can you see? Okay, so today we're going to be looking at an informational report on the impact of lead laterals and lead contamination throughout the city of Milwaukee. And this is brought to you, this presentation, by the Get the Lead Out Coalition and the Freshwater for Life Action Coalition. So we are contesting the logic of our local officials who state that property with old housing that has the presence of lead paint in those homes, that's where the correlation is. And for anyone who thinks that that the water is the issue, that is not only counterintuitive, it just demonstrates why the real issue remains lead in paint. And just to kind of put in perspective Milwaukee's some information here, in 2014, 8.6% of children tested in Milwaukee had blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. And then in 2015, we saw that 4.9% of the children diagnosed in Flint region had the blood lead levels of above 5 micrograms per deciliter. And state and federal officials declared a state of emergency over the spike in drinking water in children's blood. So to shift back in Milwaukee, we're seeing that things are getting worse here. The Children's Hospital of Wisconsin stated at a special hearing on lead in drinking water at the Public Safety and Health Committee meeting that we're seeing the numbers of children in our community hospitalized in the need of pediatric lead poisoning who have blood lead levels of 45 micrograms per deciliter or higher in their bloodstream rise every 2-year period since 2013. And again, yes, I said the children in our community with the most extreme lead poisoning has risen since 2013. So that's from representatives from Children's Hospital. So it's only getting worse. It's more kids are getting poisoned and the level of lead in their blood is getting higher. And so we wanted to look at the water, the infrastructure, and to see what some of the research out there has shown. High levels of lead in drinking water most often is associated with locations that have had a disturbance to a lead service line. So we're looking at mainly partial lead service line replacements. And then again, during the 2000 to 2004 lead crisis in Washington, D.C., the fetal death rate peaked in 2001, coinciding with the highest lead levels in the drinking water. And we're going to look at how exposure to lead has been associated with infant mortality in Milwaukee. And going off of some of this research here, attempting to link addresses of fetal death cases to homes with lead pipes or partial service line replacements from 2007 to 2009 could increase the strength of the analysis that was conducted in the research by Edwards in 2013. So we're going to look at whether, our infant deaths in Milwaukee can be attributed to anything linked to our drinking water system. And our forms of public engagement over the last few years have been to host community assemblies where we presented our maps and just had general discussions. We hosted a mayoral debate. We presented to city officials privately and publicly. And then we did neighborhood canvassing throughout the city. And so in 2019, after a private meeting with city officials, we opened up a communication file. The Common Council allowed us to present our findings, our concerns on lead and water, lead poisoning and infant deaths through this communication file. And we presented to the Rules and Steering Committee, and then again to a special hearing on lead and drinking water in the Public Safety and Health Committee in 2019. So I'm going to explain the maps a little bit more later. I'm just going to show you some of the maps that we presented and the issues that we raised, and we can talk further about these. But here we have lead poisoning, 2014. In the city, these are city maps made by the Information Technology Management Division. They make the maps for the health department. And so we see lead poisoning 2014, it's represented low to high. Lead poisoning represented again low to high, this is 2016. And then we see our infant deaths. And this is represented as infant deaths per square mile. And we see that the first category is on here, 0 to 9.9. And so we're just looking at similarities here and looking at contribution of lead contaminated water to prematurity, low birth weights, and then infant deaths. And so once we started to get our work going, we see that the original map, the 2016 map, was changed, and the lowest category of data was removed, and the map is no longer low to high, it's now per square mile, lead poisoning per square mile, and the first category is removed to intentionally make it look less severe than it is. And we raise concerns with that and want that data back on the map so all of the families know that their children are either lead poisoned, were lead poisoned, or are at risk to it. So I don't want a family to see this map here in the middle and think to themselves, we don't need a filter, we don't need to buy bottled water, we don't need to test our child because we're in an area that's safe, when in fact you are. So the city put the data back on the map, but they're still showing the one without it. And again, the latest 2018 map, they've taken the data off again, but the base map is now considered part of the legend, which is just ridiculous that they would do this, but they don't want the city to understand how fully severe this issue is and that it's getting worse. So they're taking data off the maps to make it appear less severe when we know it's getting worse. And Milwaukee was exposed for being a world leader in covering up lead and water problems in 2016 at a public policy and American drinking water conference at Marquette University. And so this has been going on for a while, and we are starting to kind of put some pieces together here. And so we went into the state's database, Wisconsin Department of Health and Human Services, and extracted the census tract data for percentage and numbers of children poisoned at the census tract level. So we can work back and forth with the numbers or the percentages, and we can match the original map that we want to use from the city. We know that this is the number of children poisoned here. And so we can work back and forth. And again, we're looking at children with really high blood lead levels, greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter in 2010 to 2014, and where the homes with lead-based paint are. And just as like a community-wide, citywide perspective, we see that where we have lots of houses with lead-based paint, we see little to no lead poisoning. And we just wanted to know, well, maybe in the areas where there's high concentrations, higher numbers, it's worth looking into what was going on there. So we started to look at the lead service lines. This is the city's data, the city's lead service lines. And one thing that we found in some of the reports is that the last lead service line was installed on the public side in 1951, but approximately 2,000 properties were built after and reconnected to those pipes, which we'll get into later, which is very important. So then I started to discover that, that there's public and there's private lead service lines. And to get the private lead service lines, we have to go into the city's database and map the homes built before 1952. And then we also looked at some really old lead service lines. Lead service lines were mandated in 1872, but we have homes from 1800 to 1872 that we expect to have lead service lines. If it's homes built before 1952, we see some of the oldest homes, and where we look at the south side here, we see in 2008, some of the highest numbers of children with the highest levels of lead were found down there. And so just wondering if some of the oldest homes have some of the highest, how this is related here, what's going on. And then we looked at water main replacement projects, and that the city's own research showed that after they do water main replacement projects on partial lead service line replacements, that lead spikes in the water. And so this is from the city's information, the city's own research. And so they knew that the lead and water would spike when you do partial lead service line replacements. They were aware of this by 2015 and 2016, and they continued to do these anyway at childcare facilities, which were very concerned about that all of these partial lead service line replacements were done at childcare facilities. So when we're being told that our main source of lead poisoning in our city is lead-based paint, and then when we find this map that's never ever once been shared to the public, yet it's been given to the Common Council, then we ask, well, how much is this impacting our childhood lead poisoning in Milwaukee? And then we started to dig into the foreclosed homes and how after the 2008 recession, Milwaukee took over ownership of thousands of tax foreclosed homes, and a lot of them just sat there for years. And city's own research showed that Waterworks found in their own research that lead levels spike in the drinking water and the tap water at homes that sat vacant for an extended period of time. So we've raised concerns about this, and the city's raised concerns that these houses were being sold back through different home ownership loan programs. And we raised concerns about what specific home ownership loan programs are foreclosed homes being sold back into. And then we looked at city-owned properties as well and started to map those out. And then we started to look at the homes built after 1951. I'm looking at here the homes built between 2010 to 2016 to line up with our blood lead level data in the census tract units. So what we're finding here is that homes built on a vacant lot are connected to a private lead service line, we believe, and that the city removes their public lead service line. And I think this is going on all over the country. And this is a major concern to us that has really taken about a good 2 years to figure this out and put this all together. And then we looked really closely at that infant death concentration along North Avenue and found that city-owned properties along North Avenue are missing their public lead service lines. When we go into the databases and compare the addresses, we find that city-owned homes are missing their public lead service lines here, and that these are homes built before 1951. A different analysis has shown that. So we're asking here, in this little microcosm area here, in between our railroad tracks and in between some wider, city streets where we believe it's its own little kind of pockets, separate little pockets of the drinking water system, is this a factor contributing to the infant mortality in this area? And so that was the basis of the maps that we presented. And then we saw some successes and some challenges based on our work. So one of the successes was after presenting to the Steering and Rules Committee, a resolution was passed that allocated $300,000 to the health department to provide services to residents in areas where high concentrations of household with lead poisoned children have been reported. There were attempts to stop our work by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Zilber School of Public Health. They sent a letter to the Common Council saying that our work was unscientific, it had the potential to harm the community, we're committing ecological fallacies. And the chair of the Public Health and Safety Committee didn't agree, and he let us continue to present our findings at the committee. And so we did. So we presented our findings at the Public Health and Safety Committee. And after that, a resolution was passed that directed the Department of Public Works and the Health Department to convene a work group to set replacement priorities and formulate long-term strategies to replace all lead drinking water service lines in Milwaukee Waterworks distribution system. The challenge after that, though, was that senior officials in the health department just denied that that line was on North Avenue. They said it wasn't there. It didn't exist, and that we misinterpreted the map, that that line was from the overlap of a spatial analysis of the buffering, and so it wasn't there. And so one of our state senators, a supporter of FLAC, at that meeting raised the question, well, wouldn't that just mean that if it's not North Avenue, it's generated from a spatial buffer analysis, that it's a half mile below and a half mile above North Avenue to get this, whole mile area here, half mile above, half mile below. So the problem's twice as bad. There's two areas here where infants are dying in high concentrations. And so then the city decided to pledge $240,000 to lead-free activists to create the Birthing Mom pilot program, which will provide lead education kits and a certified filtering pitcher to new mothers immediately after they give birth. But we want this to happen during prenatal care, which is key. So after we presented to the City of Milwaukee County Council, the Public Safety, the county supervisors in Milwaukee County requested that we presented to the Transportation, Public Works, and Transit Committee in order to help support the passing of a resolution that was meant to develop a revolving loan fund to help residential property owners finance city-led remediation as part of the home repair program. And then after this, the city took action, and now the city is providing water filters when they sell foreclosed homes back to the community. So the Milwaukee Employment Renovation Initiative, the city requires a lead water filter be installed in the kitchen faucet as part of the Mary program, which is a home ownership program in Milwaukee meant to combat the foreclosure crisis. A couple more challenges that we had are fighting institutional racism. A recent article came out from the UWM School of Public Health, and in this article it was stated, without a citation, there's no claim. The presence of lead in homes and infrastructure alone do not determine whether children are exposed to lead, and that's ridiculous. Milwaukee Waterworks detected lead levels above 15 micrograms per liter in homes that were occupied, so everyday living homes. And then Milwaukee Works has been implementing corrosion control treatment since 1996 to prevent lead from leaching into Milwaukee's water. And then again, the same professor here has stated that neighborhoods with children that have high levels of lead exposure are predominantly on the north and south sides of Milwaukee, but that doesn't tell the full story. And that's where we see the data being taken off the maps, not addressing the disturbance to our drinking water infrastructure, and not telling the full story here. And School of Public Health is not telling the full story when they show their maps to the public. The health department has taken data off the maps, and now what we're finding is that maps being released by the School of Public Health are showing the census tract average blood lead level. And when we start to look at this, we see that, there are children, we've seen in 2010 to 2014 that children in these areas had blood lead levels greater than 10. So we know that there are children with blood lead levels greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter in these areas, as well as greater than 5, but they get, averaged out. And so when we're being accused of an ecological fallacy, we actually see it here, because when we see lead poisoning like this, and we're not understanding fully that it's in these areas because we don't know how to read this correctly, and then we start to stack, income, race, home ownership, then we start to see these ecological fallacies. So health department and School of Public Health, who are our community partners, they don't want to acknowledge that the water is an issue here. So lead poisoning to them is more to do with low income, race, home ownership, which all are involved, right? All go hand in hand, but at the same time, they will not acknowledge the water. And they don't want the families in these neighborhoods to understand that the lead pipes in their home are a problem. And so we have to keep fighting over this. And we see this as institutional racism when academic research is putting information out there that suppresses the dangers of lead service lines, and that they're not a problem, they're not an issue, when we know they are. Cities all across the country are getting these things out of the ground because they are a problem. And so policy will be developed that leaves any resources towards lead and water removal off the table. So we need to be careful, and we can't just say that lead service lines don't matter when they do. We can't have policy around academic research, created that ignores a very serious threat because academic researchers just say it's not a threat, right? So there's going to be children who are going to be exposed to more dangers, specifically the north side, the south side, all over the city, and we see that this is a major problem here. And we've had our work reviewed. We're fighting with the School of Public Health in a way which we shouldn't be doing. And at the same time, UW School of Madison's Medicine and Public Health has reviewed our work and has asked to collaborate on projects with us. And then we had American Public Media review our work. They were going to test Milwaukee's water here this past winter in 2019. They had plans to test the water. And after a community meeting and discussing, what was going on in our city and showing that testing has been done, we know that there's an issue with the water. We don't need testing. What we need is a plan to remove the source of this toxin. And so they decided to build.
Thank you so much, Thomas. We do have to cut this short because we need to get, we have 2 more talks. So okay. Thank you so much for sharing this. Now we need to go to Ben for further insights on these sort of collaborations and how they work and don't work in practice.
Thanks very much, Heather. As Heather said, my name is Ben Pauli, and I am a resident of Flint. I also happen to be an academic. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting my presentation up here. Just bear with me for one moment. Here we go. Okay. So as I was saying, I do happen to be an academic, but I'm also a member of the community here in Flint. I did write an academic book on the Flint water crisis that deals with issues like scientific research in communities and science communication. Incidentally, you can now download the whole thing off my academia page if you have any interest. Like other academics, I sometimes use fancy words to talk about this stuff, but I'm going to try to avoid that here as much as possible. I'm going to be speaking mainly from experience as a resident, as someone who's witnessed firsthand the intersection of science and a particular public, and as someone who's done work at that interface for a number of years now. I moved to Flint with my family in June of 2015, before there was any official admission of a public health crisis with the water. Yes, Heather?
Can't see your slides.
I don't have any slides. I'm sorry, I should have led off by saying that this is the screen that I'm sharing.
Awesome.
Very sorry that it's just me in close-up.
No, don't apologize. I think that's fine. I just wanted to make sure we weren't missing something important.
No, I'm sorry. I should have said that right off the bat. So as I was saying, I moved to Flint with my family in June 2015. There was no official admission of a public health crisis with the water at that time. The series of events that unfolded over the next few months, as it became clear that the city had a systemic lead and water problem, was both disconcerting and discombobulating. It was disconcerting in part because my son was 3 at the time and had been exposed to the water. It was discombobulating because there was so much about the situation that was mystifying at first, especially being new to the community. So to illustrate the depth of my own ignorance at that time, I didn't even know that lead was used in plumbing. I never had occasion to think about it. So needless to say, I started paying a great deal of attention to what was going on with the water. And I was far from alone in that. By early 2016 or so, It seemed as though everybody was paying attention to Flint. But it went beyond just paying attention. Flint was such a resonant story. It brought together so many issues of national significance that pretty soon it was everybody's favorite example of something or other. And I hope that everyone will take a moment to imagine what a surreal experience it is for a resident looking from the inside out to see all of these people speaking and writing in an authoritative sounding register about what you're living through, when you know they can't possibly have the textured understanding of the situation that you do. So there were a lot of narratives that were constructed around Flint at that time, mostly by outsiders. And some of these narratives had such reach and influence that they hardened into conventional wisdom. And from that point on became very difficult to complicate or correct. One of those narratives was that for all that went wrong in Flint, one thing that went very right was the collaboration between activists and scientists in 2015 that helped to expose the lead problem. It was even touted, and I hope you don't mind my saying so, Bruce, wherever you are out there, as a gold standard of democratized and contributory citizen science. And certainly there were some extraordinary things about it. On the activist side, you had people kicking an unusual amount of butt, collecting the necessary water samples and ensuring the quality and representativeness of the data. On the scientific side, you had people who were volunteering a lot of time and effort and expertise and doing it within a politically charged environment. And everybody realizes that that doesn't happen in every situation. And no one denies, by the way, that good came from it. The activists themselves were telling a celebratory version of that story in Flint at first. But already by early 2016, when I was starting to get deeply involved in the response to the crisis myself, it was clear that there was more to that story. It was clear, for one thing, that some of the activists who had contributed most to the collaborative research had a pretty different understanding of the nature of that work than those on the scientific side. The scientists came into the community determined to frame their intervention as a triumph of science put in the service of the public good, and to shame fellow members of their profession for being too tied down by the perverse incentives of academia to undertake similar crusades. The activists, as far as I could tell, had no investment in that agenda whatsoever. I mean, why would they? Their agenda was simply to force the city off of the Flint River after over a year of public outcry. And if science was going to help that happen, all the better. But at best, the sampling that they did in the summer of 2015 was but one piece of a much broader struggle. And to some extent, it was insulting and disempowering to have to turn to scientists for help in the first place. These activists felt like they already had lots of evidence that the water was bad. To have to bring in a scientist to make that case for them was almost like a concession, like an admission that their own knowledge was inadequate and that they weren't able to solve their problems for themselves. And that's not to say they didn't want the help. Indeed, it was their realization that they were in desperate need of that help that put them into an especially vulnerable position. In the urgency of the moment, they entered into a relationship with outside helpers without any protections in place for the community in case things went wrong. And for all the good that the original collaboration may have done, we wouldn't be talking about a Flint water crisis without it. Things did go wrong. And I hope we can all at least agree on that. If you end up in a situation where a scientist is suing former resident collaborators for millions of dollars, or dragging residents and people they reach out to for help through the mud on an attack blog for years on end, or actively encouraging residents to attack each other, or harassing into silence academics who try to come to the aid of residents and suing their universities, or threatening to sue an academic press if it publishes a book foregrounding resident perspectives on the situation, or enthusiastically sharing around on social media descriptions of residents of a majority Black city as tribal. Something has gone wrong. Now, if we were to get all the way into the weeds of the scientific controversies we've experienced in Flint, we would find that they were pretty complicated. And you could say that bad behavior in some instances came from multiple directions. But whatever fault we may want to find with whoever else was involved, frankly, they didn't do anything approaching what I've just described. It was the gold standard folks who did all that and more, all while people on the ground tried to sound the alarm about what was happening and appeal for help. So imagine for a moment you were one of those people witnessing all of this from the inside. Imagine you were seeing relationships being destroyed, already marginalized people self-censoring because they didn't want to get sued, other scientists trying to do collaborative research with residents basically unable to function because they themselves were coming under attack. Imagine that at the same time on the outside, some of the people who are supposed to be thinking the hardest about how to do science ethically and equitably within communities are offering those responsible for the harm keynote speaking addresses, nominating them for awards, celebrating them in citizen science publications. And as Jana mentioned, gifting their favorite attacks on their chosen enemies with peer-reviewed status in citizen science theory and practice, at the same time that the people denounced in that article were gagged by a $3 million lawsuit filed by one of its authors and unable to defend themselves. So, I really can't begin to describe to you what an albatross this kind of stuff was around the necks of the people who wanted to speak out, were trying to speak out, who were trying to tell the other side of the story. It made it that much easier for those who already possessed the lion's share of the power and influence to depict critics as crazy, malicious, dishonest, and anti-science. In so doing, the credibility bestowed on these individuals by the citizen science community and other professional networks actively contributed to the harm that was done. And to this day, even as at least some of that other side of the story has come out, I'm not aware of any serious attempt to account for or correct that added harm. I mean, if anything, it's been covered up. So last March, at the very same time that this aforementioned article was being used as the basis of a CNN op-ed denouncing Flint residents as crybullies, that is a quote, the Citizen Science Association was touting its supposed embrace of the principles of environmental justice. And speaking as someone involved in the EJ community in more ways than one, you don't get EJ cred when you see that stuff happening and you don't do anything about it. One of the principles of justice is that you try to correct harm that you have contributed to and restore people who have in some way been diminished by that harm. You can't just bury the harm and move on by doing other good stuff like forming an EJ work group. So I know I'm breaking the rules with all of this negative stuff. Heather asked us to talk about success in public engagement with science. I'm sorry, Heather, I probably won't be invited back the next time. But to be truthful, what happened in Flint has completely turned me off to success stories. I'm certainly never going to represent my own work as a success story to anyone. I really appreciate what Nick said on the last panel about how if you think you've succeeded, you're probably doing something wrong. The truth is that those of us doing this work are constantly failing in all kinds of ways. Nobody has had a monopoly on that in Flint. And maybe what we should be talking about is failing better, rather than succeeding. And just as I cringe when I think of framing my own work as successful, I'm certainly not going to represent what has happened in other people's communities, work done by other people as a success, at least not with very careful consultation with those who are most knowledgeable about that work and most affected by it. When we talk about success, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that at all. And I am wrapping up, Heather, I see your post. These aren't just innocent academic characterizations. They have real consequences for real people. And if what I'm saying is coming off as a bit strong, it's in part because I've felt the pain and others I care about have felt the pain that results when these characterizations inflict or enable harm, even if they're well-meaning. And so in closing, I really do intend my remarks to help advance the objectives of this conference, because I would submit that if we're going to talk about success, we better get serious talking about failure. I mean, it's hard to see how we're going to be serious at all otherwise. We better be willing to confront failures in which we ourselves are implicated either by our action or our inaction. And I don't just mean the failures of particular scientific interventions. I mean the failure of the broader academic and scientific community to acknowledge and respond to instances of harm, silencing, and marginalization, especially when it takes place under the guise of community empowerment and the deployment of science in the service of the public good. I'm done, and I apologize for the overly cinematic lighting. I lost some of my light source, and yes, I didn't want to turn that light on, but.
It was perfect. I don't think you should apologize one bit. And now we will turn to Renee. Renee Wallace.
All right, great. Good day, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know, are you seeing the entire screen? Okay, and you're hearing me okay? All right, great. So it's good to be here. My name is Renee V. Wallace, and it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit. I like to talk about the people side of things. And so I come to this conversation, first of all, just wanting to center it around, you know, what makes me appropriate as a conversationalist in this area. So first, as an individual, a mother, you know, I was a daughter. My parents are deceased, but they have a lot to do with how I show up and why I do the things I do. I'm a grandparent presently to two small, a 14-year-old and a 16-month-old. And I also happen to be an entrepreneur of two organizations, one a for-profit and one a nonprofit. And it's really important, I think, to remind ourselves that even though we may carry expert roles, which I do as a lead of a consulting organization and a nonprofit, I also am always showing up as community, as a person who is concerned about a community perspective in all that I do. How did I come to this work? What's going on? Are my slides moving? Okay, so how did I come to this work? My first encounter in working with scientists was at Michigan State University, where I've been involved in helping to design a community track for innovations in collaborative modeling a number of years ago, and came to that work in partnership with Laura Smith-Alavisi, who we heard from earlier. And at that time, Kyle Mehta was a master's student and working on this as part of his thesis work. But that was my first introduction to being a person in community as an individual, but also as a professional in working with scientists around this body of work. And so that introduced me to systems modeling and how that has the power to help in decision-making with protracted and large issues, you know, in community. Then secondly, the other person that provides some grounding and also contributed to some growth on my part too, is another individual named Paul Pangaro. He is presently with the Colony, getting tongue-tied, a university, and he focuses on design as conversation. And we did work with Extension Foundation, which services universities, cooperative extension professionals working on community-based projects. And it is between these two that brought me to a place of focus around how do we really deeply engage community when they are involved in projects with researchers and university professionals. And so I basically looked at one of the common denominators for me was looking at conversation. We are always, all of the work that we do is conversational. So taking a conversation-based approach to this work, to me, was very, very important. So being able to take what Paul and I work on in terms of conversation as essential elements to the work, and when you're engaging with anyone, and in particular, when you've got two different perspectives working on a thing, to be able to come to it from a perspective of shared language, looking at the goals that each of you bring to the work, being able to engage in conversation throughout the entire process, and using conversation to actually help design engagement. So we know we're always talking, but here what we talk about is being very deliberate and intentional in the way you design conversations to facilitate strategic engagement of stakeholders, and in this case, the public, in doing research. So that is fundamental beneath all of the work that I do. When we take a look at that, it is the things we pay most attention to are the language that we're using. So we have a shared language that we are engaging around the goals and the information that's shared between the two. And the thing with conversation is really looking to maintain a cadence in those conversations throughout the whole life cycle of a project that does sustain the continuity and the quality of the conversations. So when you're coming together as researchers and community, the most important thing that's happening is the conversations that we're having with one another. And so being able to take a look at those and make sure that we attend to those throughout the entire process of our projects is very, very important. I brought that perspective with me to the work in Flint. Oh, are my slides not advancing now? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize. I thought my slides were stuck for a moment there. So I'm gonna go back. So to my work, I happen to be working on a participatory modeling project in Flint, Michigan. We are modeling the food system, and this is a participatory modeling project. So we're engaging community in a couple different ways. One, we have a consultative panel made up of individuals from the community, and they are an advisory panel to this work. And we also obviously are doing work that engages the residents in Flint. Here I want to talk about how we have addressed the engagement of those who are serving on the consultative panel. When we look at participatory modeling, there are a variety of different roles that can be played. In this case, as a panelist, you are asked to participate in defining the research that's being done, also taking a look at the opportunities to engage. So one of the things that I did in my role as a process monitor, engaging with all of the researchers, was to flush out all of the opportunities for engagement so that we made those opportunities visible to the participants on the panel, on the consultative panel. So instead of the research just kind of moving along and you just are reacting to information, we wanted to make those opportunities visible so that the panelists can determine what level of engagement they would have. So do you want to be involved in the design of the actual data collection and the research? Do you want to respond to the design itself? Are you going to be engaged in how that is interpreted and utilized to communicate to the broader community, but not assuming what those roles should be, but making the engagement opportunities clear, and then the members determining what their pathway to participation looked like by weighing in on those things that were important to them and how they saw their own commitment and capacity to generating the results of this research. So when I take a look at it and I stand back from this and talk about how do you define success, success is defined when we know that the roles and responsibilities for research activities are clearly defined, that there's clarity on those roles and what's appropriate or maybe why something might not be appropriate for the public participants, making sure that those roles are designed in ways that respect and reflect the diverse kind of knowledge and experience that they bring to the projects, and that we assume that the learning is required on everyone's part, and that nobody's expected to come to this work and know it all, whether you're the researchers or you're the community participating. Secondly, that there's a self-assessment of the participants in determining what their level of participation is and their capacity to participate in the roles. So they might be more than just advisors. So in the case of this particular project, that's the role that they had. But in my role as a monitor, one of the things I'm looking at is, if we're replicating this, how might we do it different? And my perspective is that any of those roles are places where community could have been involved and can be in future research when we do projects like this. And keeping in mind too, that there may be variances in their participation from phase to phase on the project. One other thing that defines success is having agreement, having defined agreements and benefits clearly identified in terms of how the community members and public participants benefit from the research. How do we measure that success? When the proposal itself reflects those agreements and anticipated benefits, when there are co-created writing around the roles and responsibilities and the descriptions, so that the public participants can help in defining those roles and the roles that they assume as opposed to the ones that they are assigned, and that these pathways of participation that are created and informed by the actual public participants are ones that allow them to engage in a variety of roles, and that the public does indeed benefit from the research. So I'm gonna close out with something that came to me the morning of day one, yesterday of the conference, and just thinking about this from the perspective of, we come to this as human beings. And so it is really what's in our hearts and our minds that really helps drive what true engagement looks like. So when we think about the other and we look at how we see one another when we come to this work, when we think about the public, from my perspective, when we see them as folks to put first, people to put on equal ground, and to also place ourselves in a place of in another's shoes, then we can come to this work looking at science as a means to an end and a way to engage public in a way that is for the common good. And when we do that, then scientists hold what I see as a sacred position to help hold gracious and loving space for the common good, of the public. And when we think about it and we see it others with our heart, and we engage from a place of authentic consideration for both sets of voices and knowledge, then we have the opportunity to have success, both looking at from the scientists' engagement as well as the public's engagement. And then last but not least, just looking at the mindset of expert. As a person who consults for a living, I understand how that often influences our engagement. But when we stand back and we tame that mindset, and we tame it in a way that we hold space as graceful facilitators, and then unleashing the power of science when it's most appropriate, then we can engage in this way that is successful both for the scientists as well as the public who is engaged in the research. And thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective as a person in community, as a person who leads work in community, and also as one times considered an expert.
Thank you so much for your insights, Renee. What I want to do now, I'm going to turn off the, there we go. I want to see if we can facilitate a discussion amongst the panelists, first and foremost. Did you hear anything from amongst each other that made you want to, raise issues or questions for each other, given your experiences?
I have a couple of questions. Sorry, Renee, were you gonna? chime in there?
No, go ahead. I was just catching my breath because I was powering through that.
Okay. Yeah, so I have a couple of questions. So the first is for Thomas. Thomas, you mentioned that your group's work in Milwaukee was being characterized as unscientific. And that term jumped out at me because that was part of the debate that, you know, was going on here in Flint about what kinds of claims count as scientific claims and who has the most authority to decide what science itself consists of. And I'm wondering what you think was meant by unscientific in your case and how you guys responded to that accusation.
Yeah, I think it was said in the critique was that our methods were flawed, our work was unscientific, and that it had the potential to cause harm to the community. And I think what we did was, it's pretty straightforward and fairly simple, right? We looked at all the reports that we could find. We looked at anything that the city had provided on water, lead in water, childhood poisoning, and we did a very thorough review of all this information and basically put the puzzle together how we saw what was going on, right? And we did a lot of basic data mapping, really raw data. We didn't really analyze it too much. We didn't really pick it apart that much. We kept all of our data sets from the state intact. We didn't delete any data for any child poison. We didn't delete any of the lead service lines. Everything was done intact. And we just looked at how things fell on the map. And when we saw high census tract units with infant mortality going on, I should say when we saw the map that had the infant mortality going on, what we were asking is where we see children with high lead levels and where we see census tract units with high lead levels, numbers of children poisoned or the percent of children poisoned, we can tell by comparing the maps back and forth that where there are census tract units with high blood lead levels, we can see on the city's maps that that's an area where there's a very high cluster of infant deaths. And we know that the children are being tested for lead, not all of them, but they're testing the children. And so we know that the children have lead in their bloods, but no one's testing the pregnant women for lead in the bloods. And no one's testing the infants. So the researchers are saying, well, you can't say that lead poisoning is connected to infant death because it's apples to oranges. And we're saying, well, no, if there's children lead poisoned in this area and you've done all this partial lead service line replacements, you've done all this work on the infrastructure, and the children are poisoned and there's high infant mortality there, and we know that exposure to lead in drinking water can lead to low birth rates, we're asking, we know you're not testing these women that are pregnant or the infants, but we see something going on here and we see a correlation. And then we even said we are asking and we're stating a causation here, unless there's something else that's going to jump in and say, no, the infant deaths in these areas are attributed to this and not lead in the water, but that hasn't been done. So really quickly.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
If I jump in there for just a quick second. So I see some commonality in what you're saying and also what you talked about, Ben, when there's a question about the research, there's a question about whose voice, and a question about how do you resolve those kind of tensions, in this. I'm fortunate that the project I'm working on in Flint, the research folks I'm dealing with, Laura, when she was on earlier, talked about sometimes there's conflict, and conflict is healthy, and how you manage through conflict seems to be some of the challenge, that I'm hearing, here, because Ben talked about it in his experience at Flint. Thomas, you're talking about it, and I'm on the upside of it, and I'm like, okay, when you're sitting at the table and you're in the room and you can help manage, and really flush out where the conflicts come up, I'm just really curious about, just as we look to have success, in this kind of research, what are some of the things that you think are opportunities for us to really hone in on and be able to lift up, in ways that get us to these successful outcomes in the engagement of public with research. And I know, Rebecca, you shared some things about how your partnerships have worked. That's a kind of a sticking point, or I see it as major opportunity. I always look at it as opportunity, for us to do better. How do we get
Feeling
there?
better, maybe.
Say it again.
Feeling better, as Ben has challenged us to do.
I didn't invent that, by the way.
Oh, I know, but you're challenging us, so it's great.
Yeah. The people side of it has a lot to do with that, right? How we come to it, maybe. I mean, I think,
I would say, just to finish up that, it's the way you talk about the problem across the table, right? We're using, the raw data, the basic reports, and looking at things just, without getting too in depth with the analyses and the statistics. And so we're not being really taken seriously by the, School of Public Health, because we're not doing advanced regression analyses, and we're not doing all these very advanced statistical analyses when, we've been told that that's a problem and that's why we're not going to be listened to. But then we've had other people say, well, we appreciate that you haven't massaged the data, that you just looked at the raw data. So I think it's kind of a, you have your scientific approach and we have ours. And what your science is telling you is, as advanced as you want to run your analyses, we can get a very good understanding of what is going on with some pretty basic techniques and analyses and just analyzing and looking at the data. So I think that has to be, understood, that you have a high level background and you're going to do all these advanced level statistical analyses, and that's how you see it. But we see it and we're doing it a little differently. And we can respect your science and your statistical analyses, but from the community, they need to respect how the community does the science, right? Because
that's the point right there. That's the point, is, respect the community and community's voice, and giving them opportunity to really be the public engaged in the research and having a voice that is considered. Someone talked about it earlier, and I don't know, and Rebecca, this may ring bells for you too, is that openness, the humility, and also curiosity to be willing to lean in to the perspective of the public's voice and to give deep consideration to that. That's kind of what I was talking about as well, is that consideration that allows that voice to maybe make you stand back for a minute and take another look and take another perspective.
That was in Gwen's presentation, the previous panel.
Rebecca, did you want to speak to that? Because I had some thoughts, but I don't.
I just have a comment real quick. And I think it might get at one of the questions that I am seeing in the Q&A. That, so I think part of this is who controls money, and I think that thinking about how funders, but also how universities and researchers engage with communities while they have the money, might have something to do with it. And I think if there was a shift to where the community institutions, and I'm saying this with like the caveat that I have a community institution, and I know in a lot of communities there isn't one like us, right? Like but if we had the money to pay the researchers, that might shift a lot of this, right? And I think if community groups across the country were the ones that were being funded, and then got to dictate what they need to the researchers, it equals out the playing field a little bit in that case.
I did have a few thoughts, but I know we want to move on to audience questions. Shall we do that?
Yeah, so Gregory is coming in now. He's going to moderate the questions for us.
Yes, I will. So the first question, Yana writes, Rebecca mentions that for some issues, we have enough research already. So the community's efforts turn to other pressing matters. Is there a place for scientists to support community work when it's not focused on research per se?
Yeah, just ask them what they need. you know, it can be a lot of things, you know, and I think that there's opportunities for scientists to organize other scientists. There's opportunities for scientists to organize other professional bodies to, you know, support advocacy efforts. There's opportunities for scientists to financially resource themselves, community organizations, you know, and assist with infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of things, you know, and I think one of the other pieces too is being able to also build analysis with your peers, I think will go a long way in the long run. You know, I think panelists have mentioned quite a few times about actually changing and shifting systems, and that can only happen when people are organizing their peer groups. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff people can do.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question is from Kishore. I hope I'm saying that right. They write, I think you sort of responded to this already, but nevertheless, to the idea that power is power and there's some best practices to clarify how scientists can understand and share that power early in the experience of developing partnerships. In my experience, those discussions can be uncomfortable for many scientists new to partnerships. Did you want to touch a little more on that, or should we?
I can answer very briefly. So to be clear, when I talk about power in the context of organizing, our organization, and I think, you know, my career actually would not exist if people in power gave people not in power what they want. So from our perspective, you know, yes, there are power dynamics within research partnerships and coalition partnerships and all of that. And that those power dynamics are caused because there was literally a person or persons who are not giving us what we want. And so, you know, my advice or my just encouragement to people in the scientific community is just to get very clear, because this is a discipline shift. What does it feel to you if you're not liked? What does it feel to you if people are telling you you don't know what you're talking about? How does it feel if you're told you're wrong? And I think exploring those things interpersonally and also within your own community of professionals will help down the road be able to mold and partner with organizers who, honestly, I've been told my entire life I'm wrong. And I've been told my entire life, you know, that that I did not have value by people in power. And I think there are similarities personally to pick up with what Renee was saying earlier. We are all ultimately humans, right? And I think in each of our lives, we have points throughout our lives and throughout our experiences where we'll be told we're not good enough, we're told we're wrong, we're told. And so really honing in on those experiences and then trying to figure out how to build that analysis into when you're working with community groups.
Awesome. I think we have another question from Kishore. They write, in reflecting on these community perspectives, what would the panelists like to see from funding agencies to foster these processes in future partnerships? And I believe Renee would like to respond first.
Yeah, I would like to answer that. So what I'm finding in particular to that question, because on the project, the modeling of the food system in Flint, the Community Foundation of Greater Flint is one of the partners, as is the FAR Foundation. But with Flint, with the Community Foundation being on the ground, one of the things that they're looking at in this particular project is how does this research help inform their grant making going forward? So they're looking very closely at how the research is being done, how community is being engaged, the direction that we're going in based upon the community's voice, and how will that shape their grant making so that on the other side of the research, when we're looking at the work and the action that actually needs to happen, because the research project does not include that, then they are in the position to help fund the work of community that has been informed by community. The other thing that they're doing too is looking through a lens, and that came from some conversations that I've had with the representatives, is looking at the lens in terms of how they are also informing the development of and supporting the development of community leaders by not only doing that funding, but also by being very keen to their voices. They are now better equipped to stand alongside those community members and to help facilitate growth in the leadership, you know, in the community in Flint. And those are two very important things that they can do as a funding organization.
Can I just chime in really quickly on this question? Because on the last panel, it came up that when it comes to certain kinds of community engaged research, there really are no protections for communities in place when things go wrong. And to me, part of the institutional solution to that problem means reforming the ways that grant giving agencies work. They've got to have some sort of mechanism in place whereby a community that's been engaged by somebody that they're funding has some sort of recourse when they have a grievance or a concern. You know, if you're giving money to somebody who's going into communities and literally suing, community residents, and you don't offer those residents any kind of avenue for coming to you with that problem, and if you're not trying to in some way hold accountable the person who you are empowering to do that work, you should not be giving those kinds of grants.
Yeah. And I'll build on that. That's an excellent point, Ben. I think too that the foundations, when they're local and they're community based, they can also hold the long line, because a lot of times there are a lot of issues that people are dealing with day over day. Like right now, Flint is like, like some communities suffering 3 pandemics, all at the same time. It's a city that has suffered more crises, on top of crisis, on top of crises. The foundation can help hold the long line for change, so that when people's attention falls back and they go back to doing something else and it's no longer the flavor of the month, the community foundations can help sustain focus on staying true to resolving and coming up with solutions that the community appreciates, and continue their funding along that line for the long haul.
So I wanted to ask the panelists on this, just to press further. The National Science Foundation has had this broader impacts criterion in place since the mid-90s, but it's rather thin. It could just be improving the diversity of your graduate students, which is good, but it's not about sort of community engagement. Do we need a different federal level funding structure? Because I doubt the NSF is going to be able to have a mechanism that could actually provide this kind of feedback and accountability. It's not so great at that kind of thing structurally. And do we need a different funding agency entirely? Or should we have a national funding agency that pushes grants to local foundations?
I don't want to jump in if somebody else
I'm
has.
like, in this political climate, sure, let's talk about it.
Yeah. Good luck. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really do think we need some institutional reforms not just at the NSF, but really across the board at that level. I do think that there's more attention being paid now to certain kinds of power inequalities and the abuses that can arise from those. The NSF, among other agencies, I know is talking about harassment, for example, but when it talks about that, it tends to be framed in like very narrow and kind of like traditional ways, whereas some of the kind of stuff we're talking about here, to me, totally fits into the paradigm of harassment, but isn't encompassed by the language that's now being put onto the books at some of these agencies. And so I think that's part of the solution here, is to kind of expand that conversation and to consider certain kinds of harm that don't fit into that traditional harassment paradigm.
From my perspective, I guess it would be nice if there were more grants available locally, but at the same time, like from our position in the Get the Let Out Coalition, we wouldn't apply for one, and we wouldn't want it. We wouldn't take your money anyway, and that's our position. Also, secondly, it could be, I think, even if we wanted it, there's so many groups in this sphere organizing that have a lot of influence with the powers that be that could maybe potentially obstruct us from getting that grant, potentially, right? Like, don't give it to that group. If you want to work with a lot of activist groups, that money's better here. And so I just wonder if that could kind of cause more competition amongst the local groups competing for these grants, you know, and we're already seeing a lot of groups fighting against each other. And I just would wonder if that would, you know, further exasperate that in some locations.
Awesome. Well, and a similar theme regarding funding, Kate asks, for all panelists, are any of your organization members paid through the research projects for your expertise? If not, how are you otherwise compensated?
I'll just
Say
jump
on
on that and
the,
finish mine. I work full-time in a restaurant and I cook, and that's how I make my living. And I do that purposely so I can have the two separate worlds, two separate lives. I go in, I do my work. My chefs that I work under are extremely supportive of my work, of my research, of my activism. And I need that type of a space. So no one pays me for my lead and water work. No one has ever paid FLAC. No one has ever paid anybody else. And so all the members of the Get the Lead Out Coalition are self-employed, have jobs, and do this as a volunteer basis effort.
on the project in Flint, we were very purposeful in ensuring that the community collaborative panel definitely receive, stipends, for the work that they do. As we flex that, we are taking a look at, as we are doing work to deepen the engagement, which was part of that pathway to participation design, was taking a look to see, do we need to make those kinds of adjustments? We also have community PIs on the project, some compensated, some not. Like if you're employed by the university, you may or may not, depending on how the grant was written. Some of that's in-kind service. I serve as a process monitor. I do not work for the university. I am a university partner, and in the case of this project, with the role I have, I am compensated for the services that I provide to this project, to document and look at how we repeat this work in the future, but also how do we improve it in real time, along the way, consulting the team and also making sure that the community's voice is very predominant, is well represented, not predominant, but well represented.
So for me, I mean, the only time money has ever entered the picture at all was when I was helping with a study on bacterial contamination in the water in Flint. It was a grant by the state of Michigan that was being overseen by folks from a number of different universities, University of Michigan, Wayne State, and so forth. And, one of the things that team insisted upon was having the actual work of the sampling and the outreach around the sampling that was being done be handled by Flint people as much as possible. I mean, we had a few people from the surrounding area, but we really strove to put that money into the hands of people from the community. So everybody from Flint who was involved in that, got a piece of that state grant as compensation for their time. But, the vast majority of the work that goes on here, at least from the work that I'm involved in, I mean, money isn't even in the picture. I mean, it's people just donating a lot of time and energy without any thought or expectation of compensation. And, we have all kinds of community members who are doing that day in and day out.
So we are at time, and I wanted to just take this opportunity to thank this panel for participating in this and for being willing to share your expertise and your insights.